October the 1st, 331 BC. The plain of Gaugamela, in the shadow of the Kurdish foothills, 60 miles from the city of Arbela, in what is today northern Iraq. On one side of a stretch of ground leveled by hand, by shovel, by weeks of engineering labor, stands an army whose numbers ancient writers could not agree on. Some claimed 250,000 infantry, 40,000 cavalry, 200 scythed chariots, 15 war elephants brought from beyond the industry. Modern historians, more skeptical, still place the host at close to 100,000 men, drawn from every province of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. On the other side, roughly 47,000 Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, and allied cavalry, tired from a march of 11 days, standing in the pale light before dawn, watching the horizon fill with dust. By the end of this single day, the empire that had ruled the known world for 200 years would, for all practical purposes, cease to exist. Not because of superior numbers. Numbers were never on the winning side. It would end because of geometry, discipline, and a decision made in the final seconds of chaos. A decision that separated a king who understood war from a king who had only ever performed it. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at the moment these two armies faced each other across the plain, was not a fading relic. It was, by most practical measures, still the largest and wealthiest political entity on earth, its administrative reach running through satrapies from Egypt to the borders of India, its road network and postal relay system the envy of every neighboring power, its treasury holding reserves of gold and silver that dwarfed anything the Greek world could muster. This was not a contest between a great power and an upstart. It was a contest between an empire 2 centuries in the building and an invading force that had crossed into Asia only 3 years before, with no fallback position, no reinforcements coming from home, and no possibility of retreat. That did not mean the effective end of the campaign. Everything Alexander had built toward, Granicus, Issus, Tyre, Egypt, had been, in a sense, a prologue. Gaugamela was the argument itself. He was 25 years old. Alexander of Macedon had been raised on the idea that he was owed the world before he ever left home to take it. His father, Philip II, had spent 2 decades welding a collection of quarreling hill tribes into the finest heavy infantry Europe had ever fielded. The Sarissa phalanx, 18-foot pikes bristling in tight formation, backed by a cavalry arm, the companions, that Philip had personally drilled into the deadliest striking force of the age. His tutor, for 3 formative years, had been Aristotle. By the time Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander inherited not just a throne but a machine, an army that had already broken the combined might of Athens and Thebes at Chronia. He did not waste it. Within 2 years of crossing into Asia, Alexander had already shattered a Persian army at the Granicus River, cut through the mountain passes at Issus, and there routed the great king himself, laid siege to Tyre for 7 brutal months until the island city fell, taken Gaza, and marched into Egypt, where priests at the desert oracle of Siwa reportedly hailed him as the son of a god. He arrived at Gaugamela not as a challenger. He arrived as a man who had already, twice, put the Persian king to flight. There was, in this record, something more than a run of battlefield luck. At the Granicus, Alexander had led the initial cavalry charge himself, in the front rank, close enough to the fighting that his helmet was reportedly split by an enemy blade and his life saved only by the intervention of an officer named Clitus, who cut down the man about to deliver a second strike. At Issus, facing an army commanded in person by Darius for the first time, Alexander had again ridden at the head of the companion cavalry into the thickest of the fighting, close enough to the Persian king's own chariot that Darius fled the field rather than risk capture. The first time, but not the last, that the sight of Alexander closing the distance in person would be enough to break a king's nerve before it broke his army. Plutarch records that Alexander carried scars from nearly every major engagement of his life, wounds accumulated not from the safety of a command tent, but from a habit of fighting alongside, and often ahead of, the men he commanded. This was not incidental to his generalship. It was central to it. An army that watches its king bleed first will follow him considerably further than one that watches him merely give orders from a hilltop. This time, Darius intended there to be no third time. Darius III had lost at Issus not because his army was weak, but because he had fought it on ground that swallowed his own numerical advantage, a narrow coastal strip where his 100,000 men could not maneuver, could not envelop, could not do anything but funnel into Macedonian spears. He had fled the field so quickly that he left behind his mother, his wife, and his children, all of whom Alexander now held, and treated, by every ancient account, with a courtesy that was itself a kind of psychological warfare. Darius had sent envoys after the defeat, twice, offering staggering terms: 10,000 talents of silver, the hand of his daughter in marriage, and dominion over all Persian territory west of the Euphrates. It was, by any reasonable measure, an offer that ended the war on favorable terms for the invader. Alexander's general Parmenion, reviewing the offer, is said to have remarked that he would accept it, were he Alexander. Alexander's reply has echoed for over 2,000 years. "So would I," he said, "if I were Parmenion." Darius, rejected, retreated eastward into the heart of his own empire, and there he made his second calculation, one built entirely on the lesson of Issus, misapplied. If Issus was lost to bad ground, then Gaugamela would be won on good ground. He selected an open plain near the ruins of ancient Nineveh, and for weeks before the battle, he set his engineers and laborers to the task of literally flattening it, clearing scrub, filling depressions, smoothing the earth so that his scythed chariots, fitted with blades on their axles designed to shear through infantry ranks, could charge unhindered, and so that his overwhelming numbers of cavalry could sweep wide around both of Alexander's flanks and close behind him like a fist. It was, in its way, sound engineering. What it was not was a plan for the men doing the fighting. Darius's army was a mosaic of loyalties, not a nation in arms. Bactrian and Sogdian horsemen from the empire's far eastern frontier, Scythian allies from beyond the Jaxartes, Indian contingents with their elephants, Armenian and Cappadocian cavalry, Greek mercenary hoplites who fought for pay and nothing else, and at the center of it all, the Persian nobility and the king's own guard, the immortals, whose name had outlived their invincibility by a century and a half. Command of the powerful left-wing cavalry, Bactrians, Dahi, and allied horse, had been entrusted to Bessus, satrap of Bactria, a cousin of the king, a man whose loyalty Darius had never had reason, yet, to doubt. That trust was the flaw beneath the flattened ground. Loyalty, in this empire, was bought with land and title, and what has been bought, history would soon prove, can always be sold again. There was, too, a second false ally Darius counted on, one that never arrived in any meaningful form. The promise, whispered through his court in the months before the battle, that a coalition of Greek city-states, still resentful of Macedonian domination since Corinthia, might rise behind Alexander's lines and force him to divide his army or abandon the campaign entirely. Persian gold had, in earlier years, funded exactly such uprisings. The Spartan king Agis had already taken Persian subsidies to stir revolt in Greece, and Darius's advisors assured him this pressure would only grow as the campaign dragged east. It was a reasonable calculation on paper, and it was worth almost nothing in practice. Agis's rebellion would be crushed by Macedonian regent Antipater the following year, too late and too small to draw a single soldier back from Asia. Darius had built part of his strategic patience on a second front that never opened, a phantom army he counted in his arithmetic and could not actually call upon when the moment came. Darius believed that scale alone would decide the day. More men, more horses, more blades on more wheels, arranged on ground engineered to remove every disadvantage he had suffered before. He had not accounted for the fact that an army too large to maneuver as one body is not a weapon. It is a crowd with weapons in it. Curtius Rufus, writing generations later with access to earlier Greek and Roman sources now lost, records the atmosphere in the Persian camp in the days before battle as one of near-certain confidence, officers and courtiers alike treating the coming fight less as a contest than a formality, a final humiliation to be inflicted on an overextended invader who had wandered too far from home. Feasts were held. Wagers, according to the same account, were placed on how many Macedonians would survive to be enslaved. It was the arrogance of a court that had rebuilt its confidence on the memory of 2 centuries of Persian dominance, and had not yet metabolized the fact that dominance, once broken twice in 2 years, does not restore itself by decree. Below the ridgeline where Alexander made his camp, none of this arrogance was visible. What was visible, to any scout who rode close enough, was method. Alexander did not address his men with a rousing speech carved for the history books before this battle, not in the way legend often imagines. What he did instead, in the days before contact, was scout. He sent riders out along every axis to map the ground the Persians had prepared, and when those riders reported the leveling work, the cleared lanes, the telltale signs of a battlefield built for chariots and envelopment, Alexander did not panic. He adjusted. His answer to an enemy that outnumbered him roughly 2 or 3 to 1 was not raw courage. It was geometry. He arranged his phalanx and cavalry not in the traditional single unbroken line, vulnerable to being surrounded on both wings by an enemy with room to spare, but in a deep, flexible formation, a main battle line, and behind it, at an angle, a second line of reserves capable of wheeling to face an attack from the rear or the flank. It was, in essence, an army built to become a hollow square if the moment demanded it, absorbing an envelopment rather than breaking under one. The night before the battle, Parmenion reportedly urged a night attack, strike the Persian camp under cover of darkness, when confusion would neutralize the enemy's numbers. Alexander refused. The ancient historian Arrian records that he considered a night assault beneath him, the tactic of a thief, not a king. "I will not steal my victory," he is said to have replied. But beneath the pride in that answer was calculation as cold as anything Darius attempted, a night battle, on unfamiliar ground, against an enemy who knew the terrain intimately, could turn Alexander's discipline into chaos as easily as it might unravel the Persians. He chose instead to let his enemies stand. And stand they did. Fearing exactly the night attack Alexander had declined to launch, Darius kept his entire army arrayed and awake through the dark hours before the battle, a full night on their feet, in formation, weapons in hand, waiting for an assault that never came. While the Macedonians slept in their tents, ate a proper meal, and rose rested at dawn, the Persian host stood exhausted in the field it had spent weeks preparing, worn down before a single blow had been struck. Alexander's officers, too, embodied this contrast in miniature. Parmenion, the elder statesman of the army, veteran of Philip's campaigns before Alexander had ever held a sword, represented caution earned through decades of survival. His advice, both to accept Darius's peace terms and to attempt the night assault, was not cowardice but the accumulated wisdom of a man who had watched armies destroy themselves through overreach. Alexander's decision to overrule him on both occasions was not a dismissal of that wisdom. It was a young commander weighing it, respecting it, and choosing differently. A tension between the two men that would resurface, with far darker consequences, later in the campaign, but which on the eve of Gaugamela produced nothing but a more thoroughly tested plan. Every objection Parmenion raised forced Alexander to justify his reasoning aloud, to his own staff, in terms specific enough to survive contact with the enemy. A plan that has been argued against and still stands is a stronger plan than one accepted without challenge. Cross the ridge, and the contrast could not have been starker. One king had built a battlefield. The other had built an army capable of adapting to whatever battlefield it was given. The countdown to contact had begun 11 days earlier, at the crossing of the Tigris. Alexander's army had forded the river in a night march, the water reportedly chest-deep in places, men holding shields and weapons above the current, while horses fought the pull downstream. There was no bridge, no ferry, only discipline holding formation against a river that could have drowned a less coordinated force by the hundreds. They emerged on the eastern bank intact, and pressed on into Persian territory proper, watched now, constantly, by Darius's scouts. 3 days after the crossing, on the night of September the 20th, the moon went dark. A lunar eclipse swept over the marching army, and for men whose entire cosmology ran on omens, this was not a footnote. It was a message from the heavens, one that had to be read correctly, or the army's morale could shatter before a single Persian was sighted. Alexander's seer, Aristander, moved through the ranks and delivered the interpretation that mattered. The eclipse, he declared, foretold not Macedonian doom but Persian ruin. The sun stood for Greece, the moon for Persia, and the moon had just gone dark. Whether Aristander believed his own reading or simply understood what his king needed the army to believe, the effect was the same. The march continued, and it continued with confidence. Skirmishes began almost immediately after. Persian cavalry patrols, probing at the edges of the advancing column, tested Macedonian discipline in a dozen minor engagements. Quick, sharp collisions that cost few lives but drained nerves on both sides. Each one a rehearsal for the battle everyone now understood was close. In one such skirmish, Macedonian scouts captured Persian riders whose interrogation confirmed what the army had suspected but not yet seen directly. Darius had chosen his ground deliberately and prepared it extensively, and he intended to fight there rather than retreat further into the interior, as he had after Issus. This was, in its own way, useful intelligence dressed as a threat. An enemy that commits to defending a specific piece of ground has already surrendered some of the flexibility that makes a numerically superior force dangerous. Supply pressure mounted daily. An army of 47,000 men and their horses does not feed itself on hope. Foraging parties ranged farther from the column with each passing day, and the country east of the Tigris, though fertile, could not be stripped indefinitely without slowing the march to a crawl. Alexander's quartermasters faced a calculation that shadowed every mile of the advance. Press forward too quickly and risk arriving at the battlefield with exhausted, underfed troops. Move too cautiously and risk Darius using the delay to further reinforce a position already favoring his numbers. Every day spent searching for grain was a day Darius used to finish leveling his chosen ground, and every day of delay was also a day that stretched Macedonian supply lines further from the depots and garrisons left behind in Egypt and the Levant, a vulnerability neither side could fully control but both understood. Then, for days before the battle, Macedonian scouts crested a ridge and looked down for the first time on the full extent of the Persian camp. What they saw, according to the ancient sources, was less an army than a landscape. Campfires stretching to a horizon no single glance could take in, a glow at night that one veteran officer is said to have compared to a second, low-lying sky. The scale of it did what scale often does. It frightened some men into silence, and it did something else to Alexander, who reportedly spent the following night not in restless anxiety, but in the deepest sleep of the campaign. So deep that Parmenion had to wake him personally on the morning the armies finally arrayed for battle, the sun already climbing, the enemy already forming ranks. His officers found the story remarkable enough to record. A king sleeping soundly on the edge of the largest battle of his life, while an emperor a few miles away had kept his own men standing through the dark out of fear. The final 2 days before contact were a controlled countdown in the truest sense. Formations checked, chariot lanes on the Persian side marked and remarked, Alexander riding the length of his own line at dawn on the day itself, not with a grand oration, but with brief words to specific units, officers he knew by name, men whose fathers he could recall by name as well. It was not theater. It was a commander confirming, unit by unit, that the machine his father had built was ready to move as one body. On the second-to-last night, Alexander convened his senior officers for a final council, not to debate the plan further, but to walk each commander through his specific role in it, down to the signals that would order the phalanx to open its lanes for the scythed chariots, and the flags that would tell the reserve line when to wheel and face an attack from the rear. Arrian describes this council as brief, businesslike, almost anticlimactic given the scale of what it was preparing men for. There were no oaths sworn, no dramatic vows recorded. There was a checklist, delivered by a 25-year-old king to men twice his age, and every one of them followed it. Across the plain, the Persian camp spent that same night in an entirely different rhythm. Torches burned along a perimeter so vast that soldiers stationed at its outer edges could not see the king's tent at its center. Officers rode the lines checking on units that had now been standing at arms, by some accounts, for the better part of 2 full days, rotating meals brought to them in the ranks rather than risk breaking formation to eat. Bessus's Bactrian cavalry, camped on the left wing where they would open the battle's first engagement within hours, spent the night sharpening blades already sharp, tightening girth straps already tight. The particular, repetitive busy work of men with nothing left to prepare and too much dread to sleep. By mid-morning on October the 1st, Both armies stood facing each other across the leveled plain, and the waiting, at last, was over. Alexander did not charge the center of the Persian line, where Darius himself stood on his chariot amid the immortals and the Greek mercenaries loyal to Persian pay. He did the opposite of what an outnumbered commander is expected to do. He marched his right wing obliquely, angling away from the center, drawing his own cavalry and the elite companions steadily toward the unleveled, rougher ground at the edge of the plain that Darius's engineers had not had time to prepare. It was a deliberate provocation, and Darius reacted exactly as the maneuver was designed to make him react. To prevent Alexander from marching his entire army clean off the prepared ground, off the very terrain the Persians had spent weeks flattening for their chariots and their encircling cavalry, Darius ordered his own left wing forward to extend and match the Macedonian movement, to keep pace, to prevent the escape. And in doing so, without quite meaning to, he began to stretch his own line thinner than intended, pulling units out of a formation built for mass and pushing them toward flexibility they had never drilled for. Bessus led that response personally. Bactrian, Scythian, and Dahi cavalry, thousands of horsemen sweeping wide in an attempt to outflank Alexander's extending line before it could clear the prepared ground entirely. The dust the movement kicked up was, by several ancient accounts, visible for miles. A wall of ochre-brown climbing into a sky already pale with morning heat, so thick that men on both sides began losing sight of units barely 100 yards distant. Macedonian light cavalry and mercenary horse, screening Alexander's flank precisely for this contingency, met the Bactrian sweep at a gallop. What followed was not a single collision but a churning, close-quarters cavalry melee, sabers and short swords, horses rearing and screaming, men grappling at close range because the press of bodies left no room for a spear thrust. Herodotus's successors, writing generations after, would describe cavalry combat like this less as maneuver and more as a storm. Momentum, then friction, then a grinding stop, then momentum again as fresh squadrons cycled into the press. The fighting here was fed continuously by both sides, a pattern that would repeat across the entire battle. Neither commander committed his full reserve at once, and so the flank engagement became a rolling series of local collisions rather than one decisive clash. Squadron after squadron of Bactrian and Scythian horse pressed forward, only to be met by fresh Macedonian units cycled in from the screening line behind Alexander's advance. Arrian records that the fighting here was fierce enough and confused enough in the rising dust that men on both sides occasionally struck at riders they could not clearly identify as friend or enemy until swords were already crossing, a hazard of cavalry combat and poor visibility that cost lives on both sides indiscriminately. What this flank battle accomplished, whether or not any single rider understood it in the moment, was exactly what Alexander needed. It fixed thousands of Bactrian and Scythian cavalry in place, locked in a fight they could not disengage from without exposing their own flank in turn. And in doing so, it kept Bessus's entire wing occupied at precisely the moment when the center of the Persian line most needed those same horsemen in reserve. A battle plan built on numerical advantage depends on every unit being available where it is needed. Alexander's flank screen was, in effect, spending Macedonian lives to rent time, buying the minutes it would take for a gap to open elsewhere on the field. While the flank battle raged, Darius unleashed the weapon his engineers had built the entire battlefield around: 200 scythed chariots, driven directly at the Macedonian phalanx, blades mounted on their wheel hubs and axle tips spinning at a height calculated to open a man from ankle to throat. The sound alone was engineered to break men before the blades arrived. The drumming thunder of hooves multiplied across 200 vehicles, the metallic shriek of the scythes themselves cutting the air as the wheels turned. As Arrian records, Alexander had anticipated exactly this weapon and had drilled a specific countermeasure into his front ranks. At the signal, the phalanx opened lanes, gaps in the wall of pikes wide enough to swallow a charging chariot whole, funneling the vehicles through corridors lined on both sides with javelin throwers and light infantry whose sole task was to kill the horses and drag down the drivers the instant the chariot committed to the gap. It worked with brutal efficiency. Javelins found the horses first, screaming animals, blinded by pain, veering out of control, dragging blades meant for infantry through their own formation instead. Drivers who survived the javelin volleys were pulled from their platforms and cut down at close range. A handful of chariots, driven by momentum alone after their drivers fell, tore into the phalanx's rear ranks and did real damage. Men caught by spinning blades in the chaos, formations briefly torn open before closing again around the wreckage. But of the 200 chariots that charged, most never reached a living target at all. The weapon Darius had built his entire battlefield to accommodate had been neutralized in minutes by infantry drill. Diodorus records a detail that lends the moment its full weight. Some among the light infantry assigned to bring the chariots down had drilled specifically for this task in the weeks before the battle. Once Macedonian scouts confirmed the scythed chariots among Darius's forces, men trained to seize a bridle at the gallop, to hurl a javelin at a horse's foreleg rather than its body for maximum disabling effect, to clear a fallen driver's body from the path of the following ranks without breaking their own formation's rhythm. It was, in other words, not improvisation under fire, but rehearsal paying its dividend. A weapon Darius had spent months and untold resources engineering into his battle plan was answered by a countermeasure Alexander's officers had spent mere weeks preparing, and the weeks proved sufficient. For the few chariots that did break through into the rear formations, the damage, while real, was contained precisely because the phalanx's depth allowed rear ranks to absorb a breach that a shallower formation could not have survived. Men in the second and third ranks stepped into gaps left by fallen comrades within seconds, a discipline so thoroughly drilled into Macedonian infantry that it had become closer to reflex than decision. By the time the last of the chariots had either been destroyed, captured, or driven clean through the formation and out the far side, riderless, blades still spinning, horses fleeing toward the rear areas where they would later be rounded up as prizes, the weapon that had defined Darius's entire battlefield strategy lay broken in the dust, and the battle's true center of gravity had not shifted an inch in the Persians' favor. Here is where the geometry of Alexander's oblique march paid its full dividend. As Bessus's cavalry continued sweeping wide to match Alexander's extending right, and as Persian units in the center shifted and thinned to reinforce that flanking effort, a gap began to open in the Persian line, a seam directly in front of Darius's own position, where units that should have stood shoulder to shoulder had instead been drawn sideways, chasing a battle happening somewhere else. Diodorus Siculus records the moment with the clarity of hindsight. The Persian center, stretched to reinforce its flanks, could no longer support its own king. Alexander saw it first, or was told of it fastest. The ancient sources differ on which, though the difference hardly matters. What matters is what he did next. He wheeled the companion cavalry, the elite striking arm his father had spent 20 years perfecting, and drove them not at the flank, not at the chariots, not at the mass of Bactrian horse still grinding away at his own screening cavalry, but directly at the gap. Behind the horsemen came the phalanx's rightmost battalions, pike points leveled, advancing at a controlled trot into the widening seam, a wedge of iron and ashwood aimed like a spear thrown at a single point, the great king himself. The sound of that advance was distinct from anything else on the field, not the individual clash of cavalry sabers, but a low, grinding rhythm. Thousands of hobnailed sandals striking packed earth and step, the characteristic rattle of sarissa shafts knocking against one another in the ranks, a noise Persian veterans who had faced the phalanx before at Issus would have recognized immediately, and which those who had not would learn to fear within seconds. The men in that wedge could see, across the gap in the dust and the churn of bodies, the royal standard. They could see the chariot. They knew, in the way soldiers always know without being told, exactly what target their officers intended. Above the wedge, dust thrown up by 200 trampling chariot horses and thousands of cavalry hooves had thickened into a haze that turned the midday sun the color of old bronze. Visibility inside that haze had dropped to a spear's length in places, and men navigated less by sight than by sound and touch. The press of the man beside them, the rhythm of the officer's voice calling the advance, the specific pitch of Macedonian trumpets cutting through a battlefield now saturated with screaming horses, clashing bronze, and the low continuous roar of tens of thousands of men in close combat. Below, at the point of the gap itself, the fighting had a character different from anything elsewhere on the field. This was not cavalry skirmishing at the flanks, nor infantry grinding against infantry in the phalanx lines. This was a mounted wedge, moving at increasing speed, aimed at the loosest and most vulnerable seam in an otherwise disciplined formation, and the troops caught in its path, a mixture of Persian nobility, palace guard, and whatever units had not yet been pulled sideways to reinforce the flanks, had neither the depth nor the formation integrity to absorb it. Curtius Rufus describes the collision as less a battle than a puncture. The wedge did not grind its way through resistance so much as it found the one place resistance did not yet exist and widened that absence with every stride. Alexander himself, according to multiple ancient accounts, rode near the tip of the formation rather than behind it, consistent with the habit that had nearly cost him his life at the Granicus 6 years earlier. Plutarch records that his shield alone, by this stage of the campaign, bore the marks of a dozen prior engagements, and that soldiers who fought beside him at Gaugamela would later recall not any single heroic blow, but simply the fact of his presence at the front of the charge, visible through the dust in his distinctive plumed helmet, a landmark the rest of the wedge oriented itself around as the formation surged forward. There is a version of this battle where Darius stands his ground. Every ancient source agrees he did not. What the sources disagree on is precisely why, and it is in that disagreement that the most cinematic and most consequential detail of the entire day survives. Quintus Curtius Rufus records that in the crush around the king's chariot, as the Macedonian wedge closed the distance and javelins began finding their mark among the guard, Darius's own charioteer was struck down, killed instantly, close enough to the king that his body fell where Darius himself stood. In the chaos of dust and noise, with visibility reduced to the length of a spear, panic spread through the nearest ranks that the fallen man was not the driver at all, but the king himself. Whether Darius fled because he genuinely believed his position was collapsing, because the death beside him triggered an instinct no throne can train out of a man, or because, as some ancient writers less sympathetic to him suggested, he had never possessed the nerve for close-quarters combat that his rank required, the historians cannot fully agree. What is not disputed is what happened in the seconds after. Darius abandoned his heavy royal chariot, its wheels too slow and too visible for flight, mounted a horse, and rode from the field of Gaugamela with his personal guard scrambling to keep pace. The king turned his chariot. The king ran. It is worth sitting inside that single image for a moment, because everything that follows, an empire's collapse, a continent's redrawn map, the death of a dynasty 2 centuries old, pivots on it. Not a grand tactical masterstroke, not a superior weapon, a charioteer struck by a javelin meant for someone else, and a king who, in the space of perhaps 10 heartbeats, chose flight over the one chance to hold his ground and rally the largest army in the world around him. Consider what a different 10 heartbeats might have produced. Darius commanded, even in that moment of chaos, tens of thousands of men who had not yet engaged the enemy at all, reserves on the right wing, untouched infantry contingents from the empire's eastern satrapies, cavalry still fresh from a battle that, elsewhere on the field, remained entirely undecided. A king who held his ground, who was seen to hold his ground by the ranks immediately around him, might have anchored a rally rather than triggered a collapse. The difference between the empire's survival and its unraveling was not, in that instant, a matter of force ratios or terrain or tactics. It was a matter of nerve, tested at the one moment when nerve mattered more than any of Darius's careful engineering of the battlefield around him. The king turned his chariot. The king ran. Alexander's charge through the gap had, in effect, decapitated the Persian center. But battles are rarely won in a single stroke, and while the king's own crisis unfolded, an entirely separate crisis was breaking open on the far side of the field. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, Parmenian's wing, heavily outnumbered by Persian and Indian cavalry, including units that had swept around behind the Macedonian line toward the camp and baggage train in the rear, was struggling badly. Some Persian and Indian horsemen had broken clean through to the rear areas, reaching the Macedonian baggage camp itself, freeing captured Persian prisoners, and beginning to loot supplies before officers rallied enough reserve infantry to drive them back out. Parmenian's own position was buckling under pressure that showed no sign of relenting. and he sent riders galloping across the field, through dust and broken formations, carrying an urgent message to the king. The left wing could not hold without help. The message reached Alexander at the precise moment his pursuit of the fleeing Darius was gathering speed. The moment when a commander less disciplined might have chosen personal glory, the chance to run down the great king himself and end the war in a single stroke, over the unglamorous duty of turning back to save his own general. It was, by several ancient accounts, the single most consequential command decision of the entire battle, made in seconds, with imperfect information. At the exact moment when the temptation to chase Darius to the horizon must have been at its most powerful. Every instinct built over 4 years of campaigning must have argued for the pursuit. Darius had fled Issus and lived to raise the army, now dying at Gaugamela. Letting him escape a second time risked a third campaign, a third battle, years more marching and dying to finish what a single afternoon might otherwise settle. And yet Alexander turned the wedge around, because a general who wins the center and loses his own left wing has not won a battle. He has traded one crisis for another. He wheeled the companion cavalry and rode hard across the field to relieve Parmenions' collapsing flank. The ground he crossed to get there was itself a battlefield within the battlefield, retreating Persian units, riderless horses, wounded men from both armies littering terrain that, hours earlier, had been carefully leveled and empty. Alexander arrived in time to catch a retreating body of Persian and Parthian cavalry attempting to withdraw from the field in good order, cutting across their line of retreat before they could disengage cleanly. And there fought what several sources describe as the bloodiest close engagement of the entire day. A chaotic collision of exhausted men and horses with nothing left to lose, neither side able to break contact cleanly. Blades and bodies grinding together in a melee that Curtius Rufus claims produced more Macedonian casualties in its brief span than any other single episode of the battle. The Macedonian left held. The rear was cleared. Persian and Indian cavalry that had broken through to the baggage camp were driven back out. The freed prisoners resecured. The looted supplies abandoned by an enemy now fighting for its own survival rather than plunder. And by the time that fight had burned itself out, Darius's head start had grown too large to close before nightfall, a fact Alexander would spend the following days attempting, and failing, to correct, riding through the night toward Arbela in a pursuit that covered dozens of miles and captured the king's abandoned baggage, but never the king himself. It is easy, and lazy, to say a routing army simply panicked. What actually happens is more precise than that word suggests, and Gaugamela offers a textbook case of the mechanism. An army the size of Darius's cannot see itself. No man standing in the center rank of a formation stretching a mile in each direction can know, from his own vantage, whether the wing on the far side of the dust cloud is winning or losing. What he can know is what the men immediately around him are doing. And the instant those men see something they interpret as the king's flight, or the collapse of the unit beside them, or officers turning their horses the wrong way, that local information becomes the only information that matters. Fear does not spread through an army as an emotion. It spreads as a rational, if catastrophic, response to incomplete information. If the man beside me is running, and I do not know why, the safest assumption is that he knows something I do not. This is precisely what unfolded once word of Darius's flight rippled outward from the center. Units who had never engaged the Macedonians directly, who were still fresh, still armed, still numerically capable of turning the battle, began to dissolve, not because they had been defeated in combat, but because the chain of command above them had physically vanished from the field, and no replacement authority existed to tell them otherwise. Bessus, seeing the center collapse and his own king already gone, disengaged his Bactrian cavalry from the flank fight and began his own withdrawal eastward. The first concrete act, though no one on the field could have known it yet, of the betrayal that loyalty bought could always be sold again. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, professionals who owed the great king nothing beyond a contract, were among the last organized units to leave the field, cutting their way out in disciplined formation rather than scattering, a detail several ancient historians note with something close to professional respect. Their cohesion under collapse was itself a lesson in the mechanism at work everywhere else on the field. Men who trusted their immediate officers, and who had trained together long enough to move as a single body without needing to see the whole battlefield, retreated. Men who had no such cohesion, who had been assembled from a dozen provinces speaking a dozen languages and owed their loyalty upward through a chain of command that had just visibly evaporated, did not retreat. They ran. The rest of the army did not retreat. It disintegrated. Tens of thousands of men no longer fighting as an army but fleeing as individuals, discarding weapons and armor to run faster, trampling their own wounded, choking the roads east toward Arbela in a column that Macedonian cavalry harried for miles. Diodorus records the roads themselves as a hazard independent of the pursuing cavalry, narrow tracks clogged with abandoned equipment, overturned supply carts, and the bodies of men crushed by their own fleeing comrades in the panic, a phenomenon ancient armies were grimly familiar with and modern crowd safety researchers would recognize immediately as a crush event. The same physics that turn a stampede into a mass casualty incident regardless of the century or the weapon involved. Night fell before the pursuit could run its full course, and darkness, which had worked in Alexander's favor the previous evening by keeping Darius's exhausted army standing at arms, now worked against him. Cavalry could not safely press a pursuit across unfamiliar ground in full dark, and thousands of Persian soldiers who might otherwise have been captured or cut down instead scattered into the countryside under cover of night. Some to make their way home, others to regroup under whatever local commander they could still find and trust. What Alexander's men found when they finally reached and secured the Persian camp near Arbela stunned even veterans of Tyre and Issus. Diodorus Siculus catalogues the haul in the kind of specific, itemized detail that only an eyewitness account, or a very thorough second-hand report, could produce. Tents furnished not for a military campaign, but for a royal court on the move, gold and silver tableware in quantities that took days to inventory, ornate couches and tables intended for a king who had expected, evidently, to dine in comfort regardless of the battle's outcome. War elephants, 15 of them, were captured largely intact, the first the Macedonian army had ever taken possession of, animals that would themselves become instruments of prestige and, eventually, of war in the campaigns still to come. Persian treasure captured in the aftermath, combined with what would later be seized at Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, has been estimated by ancient sources at sums so vast that modern historians still argue over the conversion. But the lowest serious estimates run into the hundreds of thousands of talents, enough, by any measure, to fund the remainder of Alexander's entire campaign into India. Prisoners were taken by the thousands, and their treatment followed a pattern Alexander had established since Issus. Persian nobility captured alive were generally treated with the ceremonial respect due their rank, a policy as calculated as it was courteous, designed to ease the transition of conquered territory into a functioning administration rather than a smoking ruin. A conqueror who intends to rule a country, rather than simply strip it, has practical reasons to be seen treating its elite with dignity. Every satrap and provincial governor watching from a distance would draw conclusions from how the defeated nobility of Gaugamela were handled, conclusions that shaped whether the next city on Alexander's route chose to resist or to open its gates. Common soldiers fared less predictably, some absorbed into Alexander's expanding, increasingly multi-ethnic army, a practice that would only accelerate in the years following as Alexander began integrating Persian troops directly into formations that had begun the campaign as purely Macedonian and Greek. Others were simply released to make their way home through a countryside that no longer had a functioning government to return to, their king in flight, their satraps scattered, the tax and supply networks that had sustained the empire for 2 centuries suddenly answerable to no one. The physical inventory of the captured camp, as several ancient sources describe it, reads less like a battle report than an estate catalog. Purple and gold-threaded royal tents large enough to house dozens of attendants, chests of coined silver too heavy for a single man to lift, ceremonial weapons inlaid with precious stones that had never been intended for combat, and libraries of administrative records, tax rolls, tribute lists, correspondence between the king and his provincial governors. That would prove, in the following months, considerably more valuable to Alexander's officials than any single chest of gold, because they told a new ruler exactly how the old empire had actually functioned. Province by province, long before he had the administrative apparatus of his own to replace it. Darius himself escaped the immediate pursuit, fleeing first to Arbela and then further east toward Media, abandoning even more of his personal effects in his haste. A second royal chariot, his bow, his shield, left behind on the road like a trail of a monarchy, shedding its own symbols piece by piece. Alexander's cavalry, pushing the pursuit through the following night and into the next day, covered a reported distance of some 75 miles in barely more than a day and a half, an extraordinary feat of endurance for both riders and horses that nonetheless fell short of its target. Darius, with a smaller, faster-moving retinue and a head start bought by the very collapse his own flight had triggered, stayed one full step ahead. He would not be recaptured at Gaugamela, nor in the pursuit that followed. He would not, in fact, ever face Alexander again. Gaugamela did not end the war. It ended the argument about who had won it. Within weeks, Babylon opened its gates without a fight, its governor greeting Alexander as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The city's population reportedly lining the roads to watch the new king's procession with a curiosity closer to relief than fear. Susa followed, surrendering with its treasury largely intact. Then Persepolis, ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, where the royal treasury alone reportedly required thousands of pack animals to carry away. A sum so large that ancient historians describe it not in talents, but in the sheer logistics of transporting it, camel and mule trains stretching for miles along the roads west. There, in an act debated by historians ever since, accident, retribution for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, or simple drunken excess following a long night of feasting and, by some accounts, at the urging of an Athenian courtesan named Thais, the palace complex was burned to the ground, a fire whose scorch marks archaeologists can still identify in the site's ruins today. The empire that had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus for 200 years had, in the space of a single autumn afternoon on a leveled plain, lost its capacity to field an army capable of stopping the man who had just seized it. And here the story folds back on the very man whose flawed reasoning built the battlefield in the first place. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, commander of the very cavalry wing whose sweeping maneuver had opened the gap that doomed the day, did not remain loyal to his king in defeat any more than his maneuvering had saved him in battle. As Alexander's pursuit continued eastward through the following year, Bessus and a group of fellow conspirators seized Darius, the king they had sworn to serve, and eventually murdered him, stabbing the last Achaemenid emperor and leaving his body by the roadside to be found, days later, by advancing Macedonian scouts. The betrayal foreshadowed in the trust Darius had placed in his cousin's loyalty arrived exactly as that early doubt implied it would. Alexander, arriving to find the body, is said to have covered it with his own cloak and sent it for royal burial. A final, calculated act of respect for the office, if not the man, and a piece of theater that conveniently cast Alexander as Darius's avenger rather than his conqueror when Bessus himself was later hunted down, tried, and executed. The irony, though, runs deeper still, and it runs against the victor as surely as it ran against the vanquished. Alexander, who had inherited a kingdom built by his father's 20 years of patient engineering, who had shattered the largest empire on earth in roughly 4 years of campaigning, who styled himself king of Asia and pushed his army as far as the Indus before exhaustion and mutiny finally turned him back. That same Alexander would be dead within 8 years of Gaugamela in Babylon, the very city whose gates had opened to him without resistance, at the age of 32, from causes ancient. Physicians could not agree on, and modern ones still debate. He left no clear heir, no named successor, and reportedly, when asked on his deathbed to whom his empire should pass, answered only that it should go to the strongest. What followed was 4 decades of war among his own generals, the Diadochi, who carved the unified empire he had built out of Darius's ruins into rival kingdoms that spent the better part of a century fighting each other over the pieces. Consider the full arc of it. Bessus, having murdered the king he served, did not even gain the throne he presumably coveted. He was pursued for nearly 2 more years across the eastern satrapies, eventually betrayed in turn by his own allies, and handed over to Alexander's forces, tried by a tribunal of Persian nobles for regicide, mutilated according to Persian custom for the crime, and executed. The betrayal that had opened the gap at Gaugamela and later claimed Darius's life consumed the man who committed it almost as completely as it consumed the empire he had tried to seize a piece of. There was no version of this story in which disloyalty paid out. And Alexander's own generals, the men who had ridden beside him through the dust at Gaugamela, who had held the left flank under Parmenion or led wedges through the gap at the king's shoulder, did not remain loyal to each other once the man holding them together was gone. Parmenion himself, the cautious elder who had argued for the night attack and for accepting Darius's peace, would be executed on Alexander's own orders within 2 years, implicated, on evidence historians still debate, in a conspiracy involving his son. The companions who had shared the king's tent and his battle line spent the 4 decades after his death carving his conquests into rival kingdoms, fighting wars against each other more numerous, and in some cases more destructive than anything fought against Persia. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took the Asian heartland Darius had once ruled. Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus. Each seized what he could hold and spent the rest of his life defending it from the others. The man who destroyed an empire because its king could not hold his nerve built, in its place, an empire that could not survive its own founder's death. Loyalty bought could always be sold again. And in the end, that lesson did not stay confined to the Bactrian cavalry or to the satrap who murdered his king. It became, whether Alexander understood it in those final fevered days in Babylon or not, the epitaph of his own dynasty as well. 2,350 years have passed since a charioteer fell in the dust near Gaugamela, close enough to a king that the king mistook the danger for his own. The empire that death unraveled is gone. The dynasty that inherited its ruins is gone too, splintered within a generation among men who had once ridden shoulder to shoulder through that same dust. What remains is the question the moment itself still asks, unanswered by any amount of distance or scholarship. So, when the center of your own line begins to buckle, and the men beside you are already running, and no one above you remains to say otherwise, do you hold your ground, on the strength of an order that may no longer mean anything? Or do you run, and let history decide, centuries later, whether that was cowardice, or simply the truest kind of wisdom a battlefield can teach a man?